Welcome to the Demystify Technology podcast from the MacLaurin Group.
Typically, you go through the due diligence process. What the world of private equity.
Right. Can't wait. Demystify it. And welcome back to Radio MacLaurin here, deep in Richmond, Virginia.
Also known as the rainforest of the East.
Ain't that the truth?
Oh my gosh.
Where's all that rain come from?
Incredible.
Well, we have Jim and Jeff here today, along with Alan, me.
Good morning.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about data.
Woo-hoo.
All right.
Now, let's get the first thing out of the way. Is it data or data?
Data.
I thought it was, as long as it's not data, there's no R in data.
Okay, right. So the importance of storing said data and making sure that it's in a format or a system that can be accessible by the future. So this naturally leads us into sort of data warehousing, a subject that's passionate to your heart, Mr. Hanner.
It is.
So let's talk about what makes a good or a bad data strategy in order to get to that end goal, so a company isn't feeling like they have lost momentum, or even worse still, lost data that they should have been collecting from the start. So how would you look to sort of advise a company in this sort of early stages?
I think one mantra you came up with years ago, no data left behind. Everybody, if they can, should adopt that. They should capture every piece of data they can. They don't know where that golden nugget may be. So if they capture everything, then the data warehouse, whoever built the data warehouse, will be positioned very, very well.
Okay, so let's talk about the capture part. So clearly people aren't going to, or maybe they are, put it straight into like rows and columns or some sort of data store. Like, what do we define as capture? What's good enough?
I would think any source system, just capturing the data there, and then once the schema for the data warehouse is designed, then we can look at every source system and figure out which piece of data we want. But the main thing is any OLTP source system, anything they use for operations, they should be capturing all the data they can.
So would you include even something as primeval as like flat files, like log files, that sort of stuff?
Absolutely. Log files can be invaluable.
And when we look at that, what are the sort of things that we need to be very considerate of when we're sort of doing that raw capture? Because there could be a lot of sensitive information in there,
Certainly want to capture it in a secure fashion. Be careful with the PII.
What's PII for the benefit of Jim?
Yes, please. Personally identifiable information? Is that what it is?
That's what it is.
What is PCI?
Compliant.
I think it's payment card information.
Yes, and that's basically when you've got a credit card number in there and any other details that would pertain to taking the financial advantage of a person. So on that front, what are the sort of the red flags when it comes to person's details? Like, it's very rare that a company isn't storing data about a person. Like, usually a person comes into their ecosystem at some point, whether it's a customer, a client, a supplier. That we're storing data here. What types of data do you sort of start to sort of say, okay, we now need to be a little bit more careful and conscious of that type of data that you flagged?
Certainly, social security number, anything that could uniquely identify an individual. Sometimes combination of an address, a phone number, email, those types of things in combination can identify a unique individual.
Yeah, and birth date, anything that you would use to create an identity or maliciously subvert an identity by taking it over because you have enough information, enough detail to do that. And I've seen it too many times. I'll walk into an organization and they'll say, oh, we don't have social security number. And they may have a text form that they're having people fill out online. And one of the questions within a larger array is, what's your social security number? What's your driver's license number? And it's just embedded in the data. And there are processes and algorithms that are designed to discern that information within your data if it's not encrypted at rest.
Yeah, because there's certain data that just looks like the data it is. Credit card numbers, social security numbers have got a known format that it's relatively straightforward to do a sort of regex pattern match on that. So how does one even think about trying to legislate against that in a development organization? Because you've obviously got where developers and the business have got together and just not through any malicious intent, but just desperately trying to solve a business problem, and nothing focuses the mind or destroys security quicker than a deadline.
True.
It's the shortcut to everything. Oh, we'll come back to that. Or it's not really that important information. And then before we know it, we're sitting on a whole bunch of very sensitive data. So to that end, what would be the best piece of advice we could give to try and eliminate that?
Yeah, I know that larger organizations will schedule internal data audits to understand what is their exposure with this data. They have a data strategy, and they manage to that. A small organization doesn't necessarily have the resources to do that, but even though you don't have a documented data strategy, to go back in and understand on an annual basis, what is the data that we have sitting in here, and what is our exposure, is not a large undertaking, especially for a smaller organization where you have fewer data points, fewer databases and tables that or files that you're storing out, flat files out on S3, wherever you have your data. The exposure is just as great because of the risk associated with this type of information, but the effort to understand whether or not you have an exposure is not that substantial. So it's you're not talking about a 3-week audit of your infrastructure at that point.
Okay, so let's talk about the ownership and just the general responsibility of that, because we often hear that, but my data is not sensitive. I'm not really storing anything sensitive. All I've got is a username and password. So should they be concerned?
Yes, they should.
Why?
Well, the username and password gives you access to everything else in there, right? I mean, I doubt there's anybody in America who hadn't seen at least one phishing email asking for an update to a password that is there for no other reason than some nefarious group offshore or even within the bounds of the United States trying to get access and take over that account. And that's the backdoor in for a lot of other activities, right? So even though the system that you may be giving up for the password and the login may not house a lot of valuable and important information, it could be a gateway to the core platform where you do hold that data and where you store that, and that's a heck of an exposure.
I know in some of our due diligences, we've seen scenarios where the password is stored as text in the database. There's not even any sort of hash there. So it's very, very easy to grab that password and do something malicious with it. So they got to be real careful and encrypt the data at rest and in flight.
Yeah, and what we also have to be conscious of is the fact that human beings are horrendously lazy people at the best of times. Chances are we're reusing passwords all over the place.
Excellent point.
Just because the information of this company is not of much use to me, it probably is the same password to maybe a bank or a little bit more. Like, really, the bank is okay, but really, I want your Amazon account. I want to be able to buy crap.
Right.
No, that's an excellent point.
But it's naive of companies to think that their data is not valuable enough to be hacked. You're probably right, but the data to which you're holding could be a key to a much bigger external system elsewhere. So if it's easy to get the username and passwords and emails from your system, then it makes it a hell of a lot easier to do an attack on somebody else that has got more valuable information, where the overlap of the human laziness, if you will, to reuse authentication is where that kicks in. So we've talked about that. We've talked about stories, etc. So what is the next part of the journey here? I guess it comes down to ownership. Who owns that data to which the company is now housing? And we've seen that in many different organizations where we've got defined areas of data that is distinctly sort of borrowed or lent, and there's data that definitely belongs to you. So talk a little bit about that, particularly in respect to the European laws now with the right to forget and the right to... That's
an important question because in Europe with the new data protection regulations, the individual is the owner of the data, right? The organization has been granted access by their client, and at such time as the individual decides you should no longer have access to that, you have to forget about them. You have to eliminate any discernible information that would lead back to the identity of that individual. Now, you could still hold on to aggregated data, right, in an aggregate form. You still have to be careful with that, right? If there's anything in that aggregable, non-identifiable data that could then be indirectly linked back to the individual, you could have exposure there. It's not only the right to forget, but it's also the right to portability. I want you to give me my data. That's a killer for, I know in the U.S. there are so many organizations, and I would say so many being 99%, would not be able to support a request like that, which is why when the regulations passed in May and came into effect in Europe, that so many companies in the U.S. just walked away from the market initially so that they could get their ducks in a row to be able to comply with that. And right now, the U.S. is seriously considering very similar legislation. So we need to be prepared for that.
So, Jeff, when we think about the right to forget and data storage, etc., it's not simply a case of hitting a delete on a table where username equals ID, is it? One has to now think about the consequences to that end. So, are we now starting to think about our schemas and our data warehousing a little bit differently in this new world of the individual holding their own data?
Yeah, we do. In fact, I would probably leave the password behind if I were building a data warehouse. The password in the data warehouse for analytical purposes wouldn't do us any good. So we try to minimize any personally identifiable information that would exist in the warehouse. I think more of the onus would be on the operational systems, the systems that are running the business.
But those schemas themselves would have to be changed dramatically in order to facilitate this new world. And I think, to Jim's point, when we were designing schemas, etc., 10, 15 years ago, that are still very much active today, we didn't even think about the complexity and the joins and all that sort of stuff to be able to remove something. Because, our golden rule is we never really delete anything. We just flip a flag to say that it's no longer being active. But we can no longer do that. We're not allowed to do that anymore.
Right. And then, what drove that mentality was the fear that at some point where you'd never throw anything away. It was the fear that at some point you would say, daggone it, I've run into this, daggone it, if I had that data for the last 2 years, last 3 years, I would be able to predict outcome now. And the two aren't mutually exclusive, right? That's where you really have to start thinking to yourself, while this data is important, if I'm not legally bound to retain that information for a certain period of time, the sooner you can step away from it and think about your purge strategy, the better off you're going to be. But that would require that you're setting up data marts, these aggregated data instances. So you still don't have to walk away from the opportunity of learning from the past, but you protect yourself right now and in the future.
Right. Well, I think that's our podcast finished with, gentlemen. I think that this is a much deeper subject and one that is starting to affect a lot of companies today, even though they probably aren't being legally obliged to do so. But getting ahead of the curve is always much easier than trying to be reactive. Thank you very much, and please tune in to our previous podcasts. You'll find them in Apple iTunes and Google Podcasts.
Have a great day.